before we get into simplifying, we're just going to make a quick list of all of our trig identities. So we know that tangent is sine over cosine. And then because cotangent is the reciprocal, we know that that's cosine over sine. Because cosecant is the reciprocal of sine, we're going to say that that's 1 over sine. And secant is the reciprocal of cosine. We also learned in our previous video that sine squared plus cosine squared was equal to 1. So those are all of the main identities that we're going to use when we're going to be simplifying our expressions. So let's take a look at an example. Let's say I wanted to simplify secant theta times cosine of theta. Now it's always best to leave sine and cosine alone if you see them in the expression. But secant, we know from the previous slide that secant can be written as 1 over cosine. So if I take 1 over cosine and I multiply by cosine, let's multiply straight across. So we're going to get cosine theta over cosine theta, which reduces to 1. That's great. So that means that secant theta times cosine theta simplifies to the number 1. Okay? What about if I took sine squared plus cosine squared and I multiplied that quantity by tangent? Well, that looks quite complicated, and as I said, you always want to leave things in terms of sine and cosine. So I'm not really going to change anything right now by the way that it looks. If I wanted to, I could change tangent to sine over cosine, but let's see if I can get this to simplify to something better. Remember that we know from our previous slide that sine squared plus cosine squared is actually equal to 1. So I can replace this entire parentheses with the number 1. And if I take 1 and multiply by tangent, I'm just going to get tangent. So this whole expression here simplifies to tangent. I want to simplify sine theta plus 1 times sine theta minus 1. So I think the first thing I'll do is I'll multiply these two together. So let's see. Sine times sine is going to give me sine squared. 1 times sine gives me sine. Sine times negative 1 gives me negative sine. And then 1 times negative 1 gives me negative 1. Now notice here that plus sign and minus sign, those are going to cancel. So I'm left with sine squared theta minus 1. Now that kind of looks similar to sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. Now in this case, sine squared minus 1, that looks a little bit different than what I have over here, but think about it. If I move this 1 to the left and I move the cosine to the right, then I'm going to get that sine squared theta minus 1 equals negative cosine squared. Does everybody see how I just manipulated that equation? So now sine squared minus 1 actually is the same thing as negative cosine squared. So this whole expression that I started with is the same thing as negative cosine squared. So we're using our identities to simplify our expressions.